This episode is part of a special bonus series presented by JotForm. JotForm Enterprise provides an all-in-one solution to streamline administrative tasks, enhance community engagement, and foster innovation. Using their no-code drag-and-drop forms and workflows, your teams can securely collect and store data, automate routine tasks, and collaborate on team resources. Educational institutions are also eligible for a 30% discount on JotForm Enterprise. Head to their website to learn more. jotform.com/enterprise/education. And a quick note, this episode is part of a special bonus series. You can find the video version exclusively on JotForm's YouTube network. This week's episode is titled What You Should Know About Creating Accessible Resources with Dr. Nieves Licwinko, and I'm excited to chat with Katie again today. We connected for an episode of the Easy EdTech podcast in 2023, and today she's here to share helpful tips about accessibility and what it means for all educators. Let's dive into the conversation. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to chat with you again about creating accessible resources. But before we dive into all of that, Katie, can you share a bit about your role in education? What does your day-to-day look like?
Sure. So since the last time we talked, I actually switched roles. I am now the Director of Technology for a K-8 school district in New Jersey. We have 3 schools. So dealing with the infrastructure in addition to the educational technology piece, the subscriptions, the PD, it's been different and exciting to get to kind of take over that piece as well. My day-to-day is, I like to say, different every day, and that's what makes it really enjoyable.
I bet, right? Especially in that role with different buildings, different groups of educators that you're supporting, just so many moving pieces, I would imagine. And so as we talk together today, for someone who hasn't heard the term accessible, or in this context at least, can you describe what an accessible resource is?
So when I think about what makes a resource accessible, and if I'm trying to define accessibility to somebody, I always tend to stick with the definition that it's a resource that is fully designed and delivered in a way that the content can be accessed, navigated, understood independently by any learner, including those with different diverse learning needs and things like that. So just really something that was created with the idea of access in mind and making sure that it's not just a pretty and informative resource, but that our learners can actually absorb the information from it.
I love that. That's just a comprehensive overview of all the things someone would want to think about while they're making choices or developing resources, and just making sure that everyone is able to interact and access, right, that piece of content. So this question that I wanted to ask you, kind of the why question, now that we have the what, right, comes down to, the decisions that are being made in different areas, right? We might know, what something is, but struggle to really wrap our head around the why, right? So for someone who might not be sure, like, why this has a place in their, day-to-day work, why is accessibility such an important consideration when creating digital resources for a K-12 classroom?
So I think as we've gotten more into the space that people are building their own resources and creating their own instructional materials, I know it's always been in the back of educators' minds that we want to make sure that everything we're doing in a lesson or in an assessment is accessible to all of the needs of all of our students. It is challenging to do, but I think that sometimes the actual building of the materials gets forgotten about. But in reality, it's so important because I come from a special education background. So in the back of my mind, I was always thinking when a student was struggling with something, is it actually the content they're struggling with, or is the material that I'm giving them just not working for their needs? Because I've seen both. And I think that that's something as an educator that is really important to understand, like, okay, no, this student does not understand, so I need to pull them aside. Or, you know what, this material isn't working for this student, but when I presented it this way, they were able to access the information. So when I try to think about, why accessibility, because I know it's an extra step to some people,
Mhm.
that tends to be the reason why. We really want to make sure that the students are equipped with what they need to fully be able to engage and participate and understand.
Yeah. And your point about so many more educators are developing digital resources. Like they're creating different things. It's not just that they are grabbing something from a program that's already been created or one that might have gone through a really nice checklist to make sure it was ready, for a wider audience. It's not just something for someone who's designing a website to consider. It's for all of us, right, who are creating resources that will go in front of a group of students. So what are some of the most common accessibility barriers students face when they're using digital tools and resources?
So just thinking as like a broad, these are
Mhm.
pretty common ones. Lack of captions and more specifically accurate captions on videos tends to be a big
Mhm.
one. I know like YouTube and things like that have the auto-generated captions that are not always accurate. And
Yeah.
as somebody who always uses captions,
Mhm.
it's very frustrating. I think too, when we think about digital design, large bulks of text that is uninterrupted tends to
Mhm.
be a barrier. Color scheme is a big issue. Is there not enough contrast between the text and the background? Is it just too bright and distracting? I
Mhm.
often equate it to growing up in the 90s and early 2000s when HTML websites were so like clunky and bright and there was animations everywhere, just very distracting. I think another one too, a lot of people are still using PDFs, as we're
Yeah.
finding things that we used in the past. Sometimes a scanned PDF is extremely inaccessible. And then a big one is also the alt text as well, not
Mhm.
having the caption to go along with the image for somebody who might be using a screen reader or somebody who might just like that clarifying information for the image they're looking at.
Yeah, those are all things that I think, someone who might not need those particular pieces might take for granted. Like it's nice to have captions, right? If you're watching a television show and everyone's talking really fast, but for some students, that might be the only way, right, for them to interact with content. So some of those things that, certain learners might say is nice, right? For others, they really need that in order to interact with the content. So captions is a really great example. As you mentioned, so many tools allow you to turn them on or off. Hopefully, right, they are stronger in terms of, right, the auto generation is again nice, but not always as great, right, as we want it to be for a group of students, right? And that contrast. It's so interesting that you mentioned that because I've been working with a group of high school students recently, and we've been doing some digital storytelling work. And that's one of the things that we talked about was just, right, the colors as they go, one on top of the other, right? It might be your favorite colors, but doesn't mean you want to pick them, right, with the text and then with the background, because it could be very difficult for someone to read if there's not enough of that contrast. And, as we were talking today, it might be something where a listener like hears us say this and then starts to notice it, right? In a lot of places, just like when someone says like, oh, I bought this new car and you've never heard of it before. And then you just see them everywhere, right? It's
Yes.
hard once you are on the lookout for something, it's hard to miss captions that aren't that great or accurate, right? Or that contrast. So, those are good things for us to consider, those barriers that we might come across. Can you share some specific examples of how teachers can make their digital resources more accessible to their students?
So I always jump into the alt text first, and it's not
Mhm.
just because of your students who might be using a screen reader. I know that some of my students who did not have a visual impairment at all would use that just
Mhm.
purely to get an understanding of what the image was supposed to be in the context.
Mhm.
So it's a nice thing to start off with. Just in the back of your mind, I'm adding a picture. I need to add alt text. It's also a
Mhm.
nice kind of editor too. If
Yeah.
you are adding an image and you're like, there's really no point. Why am I
Mhm.
explaining this image? Do you really need it? Because it's just taking
Yeah.
up space. That's an easy one. I'd like to have teachers too, because I'll be honest, it's something I struggle with a lot with design is the navigation component because I do use
Mhm.
a mouse. And so I often forget that there are people who are not using a mouse, who are using the tab or the keyboard or another device to control their screen. So I often tell teachers, try to use the tab and see if you could navigate around something you've created. Are you
Mhm.
able to? Or where is the sticking point? Where are you getting stuck? Can you go back and forwards? And then PDFs are easy to check. So if you're not able to highlight text, maybe try to get a better copy of that PDF or put it into a system where you can make it an editable PDF because the text can't be highlighted, that it can't be read by a screen reader. They most likely can't navigate through it either with that type of navigation. And there's a lot of built-in tools in Microsoft and Google and all of these
Mhm.
applications we're using that check this for you so that you're not always having to remember it. It can point it out and flag it for you. If you're missing like a header on a slide, it'll
Mhm.
tell you instead of you having to go check it yourself.
That's so useful, right? To have those reminders built in, or maybe it's a sticky note that's next to your desk that before you're, hitting, publish on an LMS, right? For students to interact with content, and just understanding that your students may interact with content in different ways than you're creating it is a really good reminder. I know I've, led workshops with teachers where we're, talking about what something's going to look like in a classroom. And as much as we might try it out on all their personal devices, we want to make sure it works on a laptop, right? If their students have a laptop, we want to make sure it works on a tablet, right? If they have a laptop, but their students are actually interacting with a tablet. So if for a teacher who's already built that kind of muscle for lesson design, right? Adding in this component to say it's not just the device, but it's how a student might use that device or navigate that space. A quick note from the presenter of today's episode, JotForm. JotForm Enterprise lets you build a form in minutes. Student survey forms, homework submission forms, online quizzes, and so much more. You can start from scratch, or if you want to get a head start, check out their collection of free form templates designed with teachers, schools, and districts in mind. Learn more about JotForm and how educational institutions can get a 30% discount on JotForm Enterprise. Head to their website to learn more. jotform.com/enterprise/education. Alt text is something that I would say I've been really familiar with as a blogger, right? I publish on the web. So before I put a picture up, right, I put in like the alt text. That's gotten a lot easier for me now that I have, a chat bot help me out sometimes, right, with generating some alt text. I'll admit that. Right. But, right, it from a student facing perspective, right, when you're creating digital resources, that's just another great thing to consider, right, to make sure students on whatever device they have can really interact with the content. So, when we're making things for students and hearing from them about their interactions, what role does student feedback play in creating accessible resources? How can teachers gather that feedback effectively?
It's really, I think, for me, in my experience, about directly asking them. And sometimes I know the students don't have necessarily, especially younger students, the words to describe why it's a problem, something that's
Mhm.
been designed. I mean, I taught middle school, so I always,
Yeah.
love to joke around that they're very honest. Like,
They'll
this
tell
looks
you,
terrible, and
right?
I can't even understand what this image is. But asking students what works for you, I always give the personal example that I love closed captions and can't pay attention without them. So I always have
Mhm.
them on. So they felt comfortable saying, like, oh, I
Yeah.
do that too.
Yeah.
Or I don't like the closed captions at all. They don't help me. And then I kind of used to document that. On top of that, I would always observe my students as they're working through whether it was a self-paced unit I created to see whether it was a navigation issue, an access issue
Mhm.
versus an understanding issue. So it's just a lot of observation. But really talking to the students and seeing what works. I always did that about my lessons anyway, but like then also the content piece. Like, do you like the way I formatted this article? Or did you prefer this way? Which works better for you? It's really just, I think, about having that like authentic conversation with them. And they will definitely be honest about what's working and not working.
Yeah, right. If you create that culture in your classroom where students are comfortable, right, talking about what they're learning, how they're interacting with different things, and you're asking them, right, about that too, right, all of that plays a role. So, for someone who is kind of wrapping their head around this topic, maybe for the first time or the first time in a long time, are there any accessibility standards or guidelines educators should be aware of when they're designing digital materials?
So there's the web content accessibility guidelines that are continuously updated to reflect like best practices in accessibility and online design. I'll be honest, there's a lot in there. And if you really dive into it, there's a lot of great information. If you just take a look at some of their recommendations, I always think that that's a great place to go. They tend to focus primarily on individuals who have a disability, but it really is just a nice way of ensuring that everyone has access. And it does address some of those issues that you had talked about with the even making sure from phone to tablet to computer to desktop to laptop that everything is kind of still seamless, equitable, regardless of what the student device is using. There's also the POUR principle, POUR, making sure that everything is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Just making sure that things are accessible via audio and visual, and that they're easy to navigate, and that the language is clear and simple, which is often one that gets forgotten about, and that it's compatible with a variety of devices. So between those two, those are always my go-to, that philosophy of POUR, and then looking at the WCAG guidelines for web accessibility.
That's amazing. And I do, as you're talking there, just knowing that there is, a few different ways to approach this, right? You might dive in really deep. You might look for an acronym that helps you kind of stay on track. So lots of opportunities for educators who are looking at what this looking at this topic and what it might mean for their everyday practice and their goals for designing resources that are going to be student facing. So, I mentioned that AI connection for me and the alt text, right? Something I was doing before AI, but maybe I'm doing a little bit faster now. What do you think is the future of accessibility in ed tech, and how can educators prepare for shifts, trends, new things that might come along?
I do think that AI is going to become more prominent. And not that it wasn't. I like to always say accessibility and assistive technology specifically has always had like a machine learning AI background. But I think a lot more is coming to the forefront as we continue to develop and grow. I like to think that eventually we'll be getting a little bit more precise with some of the AI. Like I know I use the AI generated transcripts a lot of times, and it's getting better. Even in the last year and a half, it is improving dramatically from where we started. And I'm hoping that that's kind of in the future, we'll be going more in that direction where it might be a little bit easier to have some of those accessibility checks using AI. But then also I'm kind of hoping that I know the Universal Design for Learning guidelines were just updated. So I'm hoping that there will continue to be more of an intersection between that framework, the world of EdTech, just to make sure that any software tools that we're using with students is already considering accessibility or considering it further than the legal requirement, I guess the answer would be. So those are really kind of where I hope to see things going in the future.
And that UDL connection is one that comes up a lot for educators when they're thinking about all the different entry points and different ways that their students might interact and access with learning experiences. The AI piece is one that comes up a lot for different avenues, right? Maybe it's for, coaching with students if they're working on their own. Maybe it's for educators who are looking for support designing resources like getting differentiated text, for example. But there's also that AI connection to making sure that things are ready for everyone. So I'm glad that you brought that up and made that connection for someone who's looking for their why, right, as they're exploring AI tools and resources. So the last thing I wanted to ask you today, right, is kind of that that next step, a question, if you will, right? For educators who are focusing on accessibility, lots of resources out there, lots of things for them to consider. But if they're looking for that one first step, maybe to tackle in the next week or two, just to get a little bit better in their practice as they're building and building on top of that, what is something they can do to make an immediate impact?
I think if they haven't already, the first thing, and it's easy to do, is to simply ask and talk to your students about it if you haven't had those conversations. Just get that conversation going that shows that you're, reflecting on your own practice, which is great for modeling anyway. But then to get that feedback of something simple that you might be able to do right away that your students want. Or at the very least, I know looking at kind of there's like these 9 big principles of digital accessibility, and seeing that at the forefront can be overwhelming.
Yeah.
So maybe just picking one to start off with that you could start bringing in and thinking about in your day-to-day practice. Once that becomes second nature, you can start building in a little bit more. Ideally, it could be something that your students would really benefit from, even something as simple as, making sure that there's closed captioning and that it's accurate, or simplifying the language that you have in a digital resource you're creating, or breaking up that giant block of text, even just something small like that, just to feel like you're making progress toward being more accessible as you're learning and working on all the other areas as well.
Perfect. Well, that is just so many things that people can choose from, right, for their next step. Thank you so much for providing this context, giving everyone a why for exploring this, and helping listeners understand why accessibility should be front of mind for them as they're designing different resources. So, Katie, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This was such a fun conversation with Katie, and I want to finish it up with a few key points to make this EdTech easy. Accessibility ensures all learners can fully engage with educational resources. Common accessibility barriers include inaccurate captions, poor color contrast, and inaccessible PDFs. Adding alt text, tracking navigation, and simplifying text are small, impactful steps. Student feedback is critical for understanding how they interact with digital content. Remember, you can find the show notes and full list of resources from today's episode by heading to classtechtips.com/podcast. A big thank you to Jotform, the presenter of today's episode, and this special series. If you want to watch the video version of this episode, you can find it exclusively on Jotform's YouTube network. Just head to YouTube and type Jotform in the search bar. To learn more about Jotform and how educational institutions can get a 30% discount on Jotform Enterprise, head to jotform.com/enterprise/education.